Yeah, thank you all for coming tonight. I also want to thank the Begina for hosting this event and to the Collective for organizing. It really is a pleasure to be here and share a feminist analysis that I have found to be enlightening and helpful in developing a new perspective. I would like to start, however, with a question to the audience, or two questions really. You don't have to answer though if you don't feel comfortable. But I would like to know, please raise your hand if you call yourself right now a lesbian. Show of hands. Okay, keep your hands raised if you ever had a romantic or sexual relationship with a man. Okay. So it's a lot of us. Thank you for your honesty and your participation. I am always curious to learn not just who is here, but what are the experiences that we're bringing with us and what are the things that we have in common. Sexuality is a topic that I believe women cannot discuss enough. The topic of sexuality sometimes plays a big role in our current zeitgeist. However, feminist analysis of sexuality is not new at all. For example, in 1893, Matilda Joslyn Gage wrote Woman, Church, and State, in which she argues, among other things, that the institution of marriage forces women into social and economic dependence on men. So that was 130 years ago. Since then, many other women have analyzed sexuality in relation to social institutions. And tonight we will continue this very old feminist tradition. So tonight's presentation is based on an essay by Adrienne Rich from 1980. It's called Compulsory Heterosexuality and Lesbian Existence. This essay was translated into German and published in 1983 by Dagmar Schulz at the Orlando Verlag. We might have some PDFs of these available later. We'll talk about that a little later. But basically, I will use this text as a foundation, but I will bring in other materials, other quotes from other feminists, not only to help us understand and relate to the ideas, but to show how the feminist analysis of sexuality plays a central role in the development of a feminist consciousness. My goal tonight is to explain the theory so that it can be understood and brought into the world. As Käthe Kollwitz once said, "Ich bin auf der Welt, die Welt zu verändern." Or, I am in the world to change the world. And I think that is true for each and every one of us. Every woman has different experiences, different opinions. We might react to the text and to the theory in different ways, and that is okay. What is important is to think critically. Sexuality is a personal thing, but the personal is political. We've all heard that phrase, it's a slogan from the second wave. What it means is that women's oppression doesn't just happen in the public world, outside, not just from the government or the church or in the media or on the streets. It also happens in our private lives, primarily in our intimate relationships with men. So I'd like to show this comic. It's called My Wife Doesn't Work, and it was made in 1976. This comic shows a woman working all day. You see she's, can you see this? A little bit? She's taking care of the children, she's making breakfast, doing the laundry, taking the kids to school, basically everything. She's doing everything. And at 1 p.m., you see the man in red there, he says, he's at a bar, he's getting a drink, and he says, "My wife doesn't work." So for the majority of stay-at-home moms, life is banal. It is isolation. It is routine, repetitive tasks like we see here in this comic. It is a full-time job with zero salary. It is domestic slavery. We can assume that the woman in the comic is economically dependent on the man, who says my wife doesn't work. And this dependence is reinforced by her lack of freedom in motherhood. Such an exhausting life is like a prison of boredom, and was sincerely described in books like The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan, The Second Sex by Simone de Beauvoir, and also The Women's Room by Marilyn French. But what does all of this have to do with sexuality? Well, what we see in the comic is part of a script, a heterosexual script that we as women are expected to follow. Find a good man, settle down, get married, and have some kids. At each point in this script, it is imperative that women bond with and have sex with men. It is normal. It is the only option. The phrase, "the personal is political," means that sexual bonding or coupling with men is not exempt from feminist analysis. We must open our eyes to see what really happens at 11 p.m. when the drunk man and the exhausted woman are in bed together. So why does this happen? How does all of this work together? Why is it normalized, and who benefits? Let's take a moment to think about our current social context in Germany, where we are living right now. It is not so much better since the time that Rich wrote her essay. Women in Germany and the United States and many other countries around the world are living isolated lives. We are not in multi-generational communes organized around a matriarch. Most women are living with male partners in a nuclear family or alone. Western society, what can be referred to as Western society, is highly individualistic and also saturated with pornographic imagery. A few decades ago, we had the sexual revolution, which is not to be confused with sexual liberation for women. The sexual revolution unleashed what Adrienne Rich and Sheila Jeffreys both call the male sex right. So this is the entitlement of men to access and use women's bodies for their own sexual purposes. Sheila Jeffreys writes a lot about this, especially in her recent book, Penile Imperialism. Great title, by the way. Feminist analysis shows us that patriarchal society is sexually hostile to women. And another example to show this, in Germany, marital rape was criminalized in 1997. I think it's safe to say that almost everyone in this room is older than that law. Gerda Lerner, author of The Creation of Patriarchy, says that laws reflect society. So wherever there is a law against marital rape, we can assume that men were raping women in marriage and using the legal contract of marriage as a get-out-of-jail-free card. The marriage contract was used to justify male sexual entitlement. It is good that such laws exist, but in Germany today, male sexual entitlement is state-sponsored. Brothels, state-sponsored. It's sponsored by the state. Yeah. Brothels across the country are open for business, one of the largest here in Berlin on Hallenseestraße. In a male supremacist society such as ours, the sexual entitlement of men is a force that shapes the world to satisfy the desires of men, which are often diametrically opposed to the desires of women. So it's safe to say that we live in a context of extreme misogyny. As stated before, the media is saturated with pornography, but sometimes the misogyny is so subtle and so normalized that we don't even see it. For example, women-only public events, places where women can meet with each other and discuss ideas and start to build relationships, are somewhat hard to find in this city. So when we come together, it is not only special, it is political. Which brings us to the main questions of the evening. Is sexuality socially constructed? What is a heterosexual woman? And can separatism be a solution? Or to what degree can separatism be a solution? Adrienne Rich asks these questions in her essay, and you might already have some ideas for how to answer. That's fine. I ask that you hold on to those ideas for the discussion later. As we develop and explore a feminist analysis of sexuality, there will be many other questions. For example, Rich says that children are all searching for love and tenderness, right? For female and male children alike. This search is originally directed towards the mother, usually. So if both sexes are searching for love and tenderness in childhood, and if this search is originally directed towards a woman, why would adult women ever redirect that search? Why would women search for love and tenderness in men if the first and original source of love and tenderness was a woman? It's just a question. We don't have to answer it right now. We can just think about it. It's fair to ask these questions because that's how analysis is developed. When we talk about sexuality, the popular line of questioning focuses on lesbians. What is a lesbian? Why does she not like men? What's wrong with her? This is not the focus of Rich's essay. She turns that question around and she asks, what is a heterosexual woman? Rich notices how heterosexuality is assumed to be the sexual preference of most women. It is assumed that women are naturally and primarily attracted to males, whereas lesbianism requires some kind of explanation. She says, the assumption of female heterosexuality seems to me in itself remarkable. It is an enormous assumption to have glided so silently into the foundations of our thought. I am suggesting that heterosexuality, like motherhood, needs to be recognized and studied as a political institution. So the dominant worldview says that heterosexuality is normal or natural, and most people think this. What does this mean then for women who love women? Women who choose other women as life partners, as lovers, as passionate comrades, women who choose the community of women? We are supposed to believe that there is something wrong about them. We are supposed to believe that such women never even existed. We've always been here, but the records of our existence, of lesbian existence, are systematically destroyed. Rich says, the destruction of records and memorabilia and letters documenting the realities of lesbian existence must be taken very seriously as a means of keeping heterosexuality compulsory for women, since what has been kept from our knowledge is joy, sensuality, courage, and community, as well as guilt, self-betrayal, and pain. Women, and especially lesbians, are isolated, not just from each other, but from our histories. We learn in school about all these important men and great myths about male heroes, but not so much about all the important women, the women who resisted. From a feminist perspective, it is a huge problem that women's works are not taken seriously, that women are erased from historical record, because generation after generation, young women are spending way too much time trying to reinvent the wheel. It's not easy to access the knowledge and the experiences of the women, the lesbians, the resistors who came before us, and it is made difficult for a reason. This is why feminist historians and librarians are so necessary. Just to name a few, there is Max Dashu, who created the Suppressed Histories Archives. There's also in German a data bank, die Datenbank Fembio, Frauenbiografieforschung von Louise F. Pusch. There's Frauenkultur, but that's actually in English. I don't know why the German, we'll have to look into that later. Frauenkultur is a second wave feminist reading archive made by Beck Wonders. And another great example is the recent book by Doris Hermanns called Sand im patriarchalen Getriebe zur Geschichte der Frauenbuchbewegung. Thanks to Doris Hermanns. Women's literature and records are of the utmost importance for women. Claire Huchin, a lesbian theorist and writer, she says, quote, "The unnatural split between theory and practice is why so many younger feminists are trying to reinvent the wheel instead of understanding themselves as a part of a movement that has spanned continents and decades." So it is wonderful that we have this book table here tonight. During the break and after the discussion, please take a look at the books and the texts that are here, made possible by the wonderful woman running the women's bookstore next door. Thank you very much. This is not just simple literature. This is our history, our politics, our lives. This is our existence that lives on after we are gone. It is the proof of our resistance. And it is no wonder that this proof that our history is systematically destroyed, forgotten, ignored. Women are kept ignorant. Women are told that there is only one option, only one life path. We are told that women love men, women need men, because God says so, because it's the natural order of things, because of some biological inclination that draws women towards men. One of my favorite patriarchal arguments is that if women stop having sex with men, then our species would die out. It's really entertaining, I think, this argument. This is an example of fear-mongering. This is shocking women into compliance. As women in South Korea have said, women are not baby-making machines. It is sexist to argue that it is somehow in woman's nature to want to have babies or to even want to have sex with men in the first place. But this patriarchal argument also ignores how men use the act of intercourse to subjugate women. When women refuse to have sex with men, women are not just refusing a sex act. Women are also refusing to make men feel powerful. Feminists have analyzed the act of heterosexual intercourse, and they have argued that it is not beneficial for women at all. Andrea Dworkin illustrates this in many of her texts and speeches. In her book Intercourse from 1987, she makes the argument that intercourse depends on the social inferiority of women. And she says, the current dogma is to teach by rote that sex is healthy, as if it existed outside of social relations, as if it had no ties whatsoever to anything mean or low down, to history, to power, to the dispossession of women from freedom. We cannot exclude the heterosexual sex act or heterosexuality itself from feminist analysis. Es gehört dazu. Like everything else, it exists in the social context of patriarchy. Feminist theorists like D. Graham, for example, who wrote Loving to Survive, argue that the sex act is where women are simultaneously most vulnerable to male violence, but at the same time most bonded to our oppressors. There's more to sex than just making babies. Adrienne Rich challenges the associations around intercourse, and she asks a question. Why is the survival of our species so rigidly associated with emotional or erotic relationships? We know that in matrilineal or matrifocal societies, these things are not so closely related. But in patriarchal societies, in almost all of them around the globe, I would argue, emotional connections, eroticism, and sex are packaged together into a one-size-fits-all script. And this script is the program of patriarchal society. So feminists have criticized this organization of society around the heterosexual couple. Adrienne Rich argues that this couple is the main organizing unit of patriarchal power. She also asks whether the institution of marriage is really desirable for women at all. And one of the main points she's saying is, the heterosexual couple is the main organizing force of patriarchal power. Feminist criticism of marriage is also not new. Germaine Greer, in her book The Whole Woman, criticizes the role of women as wives, as property of men. Dworkin, again, compares marriage to prostitution, a sexual arrangement made out of economic necessity. And looking at the family, which, according to the script, follows after marriage, Kate Millett says the family is the chief institution of patriarchy. So she says, patriarchy's chief institution is the family. It is both a mirror of and a connection with the larger society. It is a patriarchal unit within a patriarchal whole, mediating between the individual and the social structure. The family effects control and conformity where political and other authorities are insufficient. As the fundamental instrument and the foundation unit of patriarchal society, the family and its roles are prototypical. So what she's saying is, we have the macro, the broader society, and the micro, the family, that replicates all of these things. The nuclear family is where girls and boys are introduced to the patriarchal status quo. We are trained to follow that script as we are children. What are we supposed to do? And what happens when we step out of line? Adrienne Rich asks us to look honestly at what heterosexuality is and how it is maintained. If we look at it today, we see that some very strange practices are accepted as normal, like sexual intercourse every 2 days, choking during sex, or other BDSM practices. And I want to say this acronym for what it really is, because people just say the acronym and they don't actually say the meaning of the words. It's bondage, dominance, sadism, and masochism. There's a whole culture around this. Instead of normalizing these practices, we can develop a feminist analysis about them. And from a feminist perspective, these are manifestations of an institutional power structure which serve a political purpose. Question: if girls are born to have babies or to give men sexual pleasure, does that mean boys are born to sexually dominate women? I don't think so. That was a rhetorical question. I think these things are learned, not innate. However, if we accept the idea that some women are innately heterosexual, then it becomes impossible to develop a feminist analysis about it. I don't think anyone is born with a natural inclination for sexual submission. Sexuality for women is often shaped by force, and Rich brings attention to the fact that violence is necessary to maintain women's total emotional and erotic loyalty and subservience to men. So to be clear, I repeat, violence is necessary to maintain women's subservience to men. So how? How is heterosexuality enforced? What are the forces that shape women's sexuality or that shape the general public's belief about sexuality? Well, Adrienne Rich answers that question. She references the work of Kathleen Goh, and Kathleen Goh identified different characteristics of male power, different forces that are all working together all of the time. Rich expands on Go's ideas through the lens of, through a feminist lens regarding sexuality. So there are 8 characteristics, and we will go through them together one by one. Try to be a bit brief, but here we go. Characteristics of male power include the power of men to deny women their own sexuality, or to force male sexuality upon women, to command or to exploit women's labor, to control what we produce, to control or rob women of their children, to confine women physically and prevent their movement, to use women as objects in male transactions, to cramp women's creativeness, and lastly, to withhold from women large areas of the society's knowledge and cultural attainments. So let's see how these forces of male power are still exercised today worldwide. So the first one, the power of men to deny women their own sexuality. So Rich offers several examples in her text. I will read only a few, and then we'll look at something current. Rich says examples of this are, they include FGM, clitoridectomy, chastity belts, punishment including death for lesbian sexuality, the denial of the clitoris, rules against masturbation, and also the closing of archives and destruction of documents relating to lesbian existence. So here we see a map. It's a bit hard to read. It says at the top, criminalization of consensual same-sex sexual acts. And so this map, I believe, is from 2024, 25. It's recent, I promise. Unfortunately, it doesn't show the difference between female homosexual acts and male homosexual acts. And some countries don't make that difference. But from 2024, there were 64 countries that criminalized same-sex acts in general. 40 of those countries made a difference between female or male homosexuality, and 12 had the death penalty. So that was now just 2 years ago. Another example of this characteristic of male power is the lack of knowledge about women's anatomy. The first comprehensive anatomical study of the clitoris was in 1998. I'm older than, almost all of us are older than this. The clitoris has, of course, been around for a very long time. And so even the language we use for our body parts is male-centered. The English word vagina comes from the Latin word for sheath or covering, which indicates an object of negative space, which serves the purpose of holding another foreign object. A deadly weapon, to be correct. And auf Deutsch ist es auch ähnlich in der deutschen Sprache. Vagina heißt Scheide. Das ist das, worin man ein Messer oder Schwert zur sicheren Aufbewahrung steckt. Aber das Wort Schamlippen, das ist frauenfeindlich. Ein Teil unseres Körpers, der Scham genannt wird, das ist furchtbar. This language defines us in relation to a sexual function, reinforcing taboos around the female sex. It is misogynist that women are denied words for our own bodies that are independent from men. So even what we are called is in relation to men. I find that unglaublich. Anyway, going on. The power of men to force male sexuality upon women. So the examples she gives are, just to name a few, rape, including marital rape and wife beating, incest, the idealization of heterosexual romance in art, literature, the media, advertising, etc., as well as pornographic depictions of women responding pleasurably to sexual violence and humiliation. So here we go. 50 Shades of Grey becomes the best-selling book ever in Britain. On the left, 50 Shades trilogy takes the first 3 spots on the top 10 best-selling novels of the decade list. And then, 3 months later, Grace Millane and the Rise of the 50 Shades Defense in Murder Trials. The book 50 Shades of Grey was written by a woman, but the fantasy is absolutely male. Not only is it pornographic, but it is incredibly violent. As we see, Grace Millane was murdered by a man in the act of heterosexual intercourse. And he argued that she asked for it. And he got a reduced sentence for that. 50 Shades normalizes violence in sex by bringing into the mainstream the idea that male violence is sexy. All right, moving on. Here's an example which I was really not sure where to put. Is it men denying women's sexuality, or is it men forcing their own sexuality on women? Let's take a look. How to have lesbian sex with a trans woman. And some excerpts from the text are, some lesbian women have penises. And then a header below says, use your mouth. So it's full of tips and hinweise how you can have better sex with a trans woman. It says, like hand sex, oral sex on a trans woman's penis looks different from oral sex on a cis penis. I don't know the difference. I don't care to learn the difference. I think this is an example of both forces. Fun fact, the word penis appears 37 times in this article. This eloquently describes the force of male power on lesbians to accept men as sexual partners. This is a fantastic and very recent example of male sexual entitlement, and of what Sheila Jeffries and Adrienne Rich both call the male sex right. Moving on. Thank you. The power of men to command or exploit women's labor to control what we produce. The examples Rich gives are the male control of abortion, contraception, and childbirth, as well as female infanticide. So here, this article says nearly 65,000 US rape victims could not get an abortion in their state. Researchers estimated this likely number. This number was related to the overturning of Roe v. Wade. In 2022, over 1/3 of states restricted or banned abortion. That's 21 out of 50. And so here we see a map from 2025, which shows which of those states that restrict or ban abortion completely. Dark red is a full ban. And then as the red gets lighter, it's ban after 6 weeks, ban after 12 weeks. And then the blue, dark blue, is ban after 22 weeks, which is not really, yeah, it's got to not get into it. But anyway, this means that men in the United States have the power to force women into motherhood. Men can rape women, impregnate women against their will, and then the state will force these women to carry the pregnancy to term and then to try giving birth. All while the United States has the highest maternal mortality rate of all of the so-called developed countries in the world. And the mortality rate of Black pregnant women is more than double that of white pregnant women. And this map shows, with the darker color, it's the maternal mortality rate per 100,000 births. This is aggregated data, but as you can see, the states with the highest maternal mortality rate, where most women die in childbirth, surprisingly have abortion bans. Funny that. Continuing on. The power of men to control or rob women of their children. Rich says an example is the father right. So when men argue that they have a right to custody of a child because they are the father of the child, as well as enforced sterilization and the seizure of children from lesbian mothers by the courts. Oh, and so here we have 3 headlines. Indigenous women still forced, coerced into sterilization. That's from Canada. Greenlandic women detail Danish forced contraception. That's from Denmark and Greenland. And then at the bottom, Peru's forced sterilization policy could constitute a crime against humanity. Well, of course it does. It is a crime against humanity. These are just 3 headlines about different countries around the world practicing eugenics, or the forced sterilization of different groups of women based on race, ethnicity, or most often because they were indigenous women. And in the United States, I didn't put a headline about the US, but it's important to mention, in the 1960s and 70s, doctors sterilized at least 25% of Native American women of childbearing age. And the real number is argued to be much higher, around 50%. You can all check this out after the presentation. Yeah, as I researched eugenics, I was surprised at how many news articles I found from so many different countries around the world. It's not just the USA or Peru or Greenland or Canada, but it's also Japan and China and India. There's also been forced sterilization of Roma women in the Czech Republic. Yeah, this is some of this is just now coming to light. Some of these headlines are from September 2025. Let's move on. I promise it gets better after the break. Let's just get through these examples. Here is the power of men to confine women physically, number 5, and prevent their movement. Rich says the examples of this are foot binding, also using rape as terrorism to keep women off the streets, or sexual harassment on the streets as well. She also mentions high heels and feminine dress codes, as well as the veil. And so I want to show this comic. It was drawn by a man, so there are flaws in the comparison. I can explain it. Maybe you have seen it. There's a comic where on the left, there's a woman with a bikini, big sunglasses, hair in a ponytail, high heels, with a purse. And on the right, there's a woman in a full burqa. And they're both having these thought bubbles. And in the thought bubbles, it says, how cruel. Nothing, what is it? The one says, nothing covered but her eyes. And the other says, everything covered but her eyes. What a cruel, male-dominated culture. Something like this. Oh, anyway, we can continue without it. The funny thing is that both women are correct in this thinking, but the woman in the burqa would probably feel more liberated if she could take that cloth off without facing any punishment, feel the wind in her hair. And the woman in the bikini might feel more capable to take action if her body was less vulnerable and exposed, if her feet and spine were not crippled by high heel shoes, if her skin was not poisoned by cancer-causing ingredients found in beauty products today. So the comic showed these women, I guess, walking on a street, but it's a bit incorrect because what you wear on the beach, a bikini, is not really what you would wear on the street. But anyway, let's keep going. I think this is a very powerful force because it's so normalized, and I wanted to show some examples of women resisting, kind of from both sides of the coin. Here are some women athletes. The Norwegian women's beach handball team was fined. They had to pay a fine because they wore shorts instead of bikinis. And here's Serena Williams, one of the best, probably the best tennis player of all time. She wore this full bodysuit, and then the authorities of the tennis game, I guess, they said, one must respect the game. So they accused Serena Williams of disrespecting tennis because she wore too much clothing. The bodysuit ban was ultimately unsuccessful, but still, this shows when women from the West tried to put on more clothing, we get punished for it. And here we see examples kind of the other side. These women are challenging the mandatory hijab. These are the girls of the Revolution Street in Iran. In the last years, and also very recently, we've seen brave women who are protesting this. In 2017, the woman here on the left stood on top of a kind of utility box on the street. She had a white headscarf. She took it off, tied it on a stick, and just waved the stick around for like half an hour before she was arrested. And almost 1 month later, another woman protested on the same spot. She did the same thing. And there were continually more and more women doing this protest, so that the authorities built some kind of thing around the box to prevent women from standing up there and protesting more. So that's nice. Women are taking off a part of the clothing and they're getting punished for it. All right, moving on. The power of men to use women as objects in male transactions. Rich says an example of this is using women as gifts, also pimping or arranged marriages, the use of women as entertainers, such as cocktail waitresses, who are required to dress for male sexual excitement. So here is an article from Der Spiegel. Job center apologizes for offer in bordello. It's happened again. It's my favorite part. It's happened again. A German job center has tried to line up a position for a young woman in a brothel. The job was just serving drinks, but it rekindled a debate about how far the government should go to get people back in the workforce. So she was not, the woman was unemployed, and she was getting job offers from the Bundesagentur für Arbeit. And they gave her the offer of a job in a brothel. And as a waitress, of course. When women are hired to work in brothels, the woman herself doesn't matter as an individual or a person. She is interchangeable with almost every other woman on the planet, and the role that she is forced to play exists for the purpose of fulfilling men's sexual desires. Prostitution is a system. It is not women's sexuality. It is the expression of men's sexual power over women. And as we see in Germany, this logic of male sexual entitlement is state-sanctioned. Number 7. The power of men to cramp women's creativeness. Rich offers the examples of the witch persecutions, which were campaigns against midwives and female healers and independent women. She also mentions the social and economic disruption of women's creative aspirations. So here we see three images that show the persecution of independent women. The first on the left is from 1655, showing a man punishing a woman for being a scold. And that means she talked too much, or she said the wrong thing, she insulted the wrong man maybe. She wears a bridle, which is a cage that is locked around the head, and then a piece of metal is inserted in the mouth to hold the tongue down. You can see maybe you can see in the picture. So she couldn't talk anymore. The second in the middle is a postcard from the early 20th century. The image is in response to the women's suffrage movement, and it says, "What I would do with the suffragists." The woman's jaw is locked shut, so she can't talk anymore. And the third is an internet meme. It tells the viewer to shut up, and this is usually sent to women online who say the wrong things. And notice the gun is pointed at the viewer, so this is a an order, and a threat. As J.K. Rowling shared some of these photos, and she was absolutely true in saying, it really is the same shit, different century. Now, I would argue that creativity requires a freedom of thought, and freedom of thought means also freedom of speech, freedom of expression. But over the centuries, women have been punished for expressing their ideas, for communicating their boundaries, for demanding to have a political existence. Women have been disallowed from speaking their thoughts, and this stifles creativity and destroys independence. Silvia Federici writes in her book, Caliban and the Witch, about how women in medieval Europe were accused of being unreasonable, vain, and wild. Especially blamed was the female tongue, seen as an instrument of insubordination. And the picture on the left, I believe, is in her book. So, question, it really makes you wonder, how dangerous is it really when women start talking? And finally, the power of men to withhold from women large areas of society's culture, cultural attainments, and knowledge. Rich offers the example of the non-education of females and also discrimination against women in the workforce, in the professions. So we can talk about the gender pay gap as an example. We can talk about how women are harassed at work, especially in male-dominated fields like science, engineering, technology. But one of the most devastating manifestations of this characteristic, in my opinion, is preventing women and girls from gaining an education. And we are now entering the 5th year. This says 4 years on, but this year is the 5th year. 2.2 million girls still banned from school in Afghanistan. Women and girls in Afghanistan are not allowed to teach or to go to school, to go outside on their own, or even to look outside the window if that window is facing another window where another woman could possibly be looking out of. They are living under an extremely oppressive patriarchal regime, one which exercises very clearly the power of men to withhold from women the knowledge of society and culture. However, this force is not limited to Afghanistan. For the last centuries around the world, the vast majority of women and girls have been denied an education. For example, in Germany, Heidelberg University was founded in 1386. 600 years later, women were allowed to attend in the year 1900, roughly 600 years later. Or in England, Oxford University, founded in the year 1096. 800 years later, the university organized separate colleges for women to attend in 1879. We can think of other examples, other news articles, other things that happened in the world that illustrate these 8 characteristics. But the point that Adrienne Rich is making is that we are confronting a pervasive cluster of forces ranging from physical brutality to control of consciousness, which suggests that an enormous potential counterforce is having to be restrained. Women are powerful, we are strong people, and we can be very independent, but we are continuously being programmed to believe the opposite, that we're not strong, that independence is somehow unmanageable, or that empowerment for women somehow resembles exactly what men want us to do. We are told that we need men to protect us, but we aren't told who we need to be protected from. To quote Adrienne Rich, women have been convinced that marriage and sexual orientation toward men are inevitable, even if unsatisfying or oppressive components of their lives. And today, in our media-saturated world, we must not forget how influential pornography is in getting that message across. Rich says the message of pornography is that women are natural sexual prey to men and love it, that sexuality and violence are congruent, and that for women, sex is essentially masochistic, that humiliation is pleasurable, that physical abuse is erotic, that enforced submission and the use of cruelty is normal, while sensuality between women is queer or sick or pornographic in itself or just not exciting at all. She says pornography widens the range of behavior considered acceptable from men in heterosexual intercourse. This is one reason why women like myself hesitate to come out as lesbian, because that word is associated with a category of pornography. This is an example of the very first characteristic of male power, denying women their own sexuality. So, question, why do men go through all that trouble? Some psychoanalysts have argued that men have a need to control women because they have a primal fear of women. But Adrienne Rich says, no. It's more probable that men really fear that women could be indifferent to them altogether. Men are afraid of the possibility that women don't care, that women might actually be quite fine without men. So men have then constructed elaborate systems and rituals to put themselves at the center of the universe, to reward women who play along with it, and to punish those of us who don't. Rich says, if we look at the elaborate and extensive measures designed to keep women controlled by men, dependent on men, loyal and committed to men, then we can see clearly that the enforcement of heterosexuality for women is a means of assuring the male right of physical, economic, and emotional access to women. So question, if all of those forces, these 8 forces, and others did not exist, if women were not punished for saying no to men, would women say yes to men? Would women really love men? Rich says, the assumption that most women are innately heterosexual is a theoretical and political stumbling block for feminism. For women, heterosexuality may not be a preference at all, but something that has to be imposed, managed, organized, propagandized, and maintained by force. So before the break, I just want to bring this thought into the room. If you consider yourself to be heterosexual, then it is a huge step for you to acknowledge the possibility that it may not be a preference at all, but something that has been imposed upon you. So I'd say now let's take a break. And after the break, we will see some really cool examples of women's resistance. Before the break, we looked at ways in which heterosexuality is made compulsory for women. Now we will take a look at women's behaviors and how women find ways to escape compulsory heterosexuality against all odds. Before the break, we also asked a very important question. Analysis is built from questions. And the question is, if women were not forced to be with men, if women could say no to men, then would women really love men? Of course, some people will say that it's not all men who are bad. Not all men are like that. Some men really love women. But I have another question. When men say that they love women, what do they really mean? Marilyn Fry has an answer. According I love feminist analysis. It's full of answers. So Marilyn Frye says, to say that straight men are heterosexual is only to say that they engage in sex or fucking exclusively with or upon or to the other sex, i.e. women. All or almost all of that which pertains to love, most straight men reserve exclusively for other men. The people whom they admire, respect, adore, revere, honor, whom they imitate, idolize, and form profound attachments to, the people whom they are willing to teach and from whom they are willing to learn, and whose respect, admiration, recognition, honor, reverence, and love they desire, those are overwhelmingly other men. In their relations with women, what passes for respect is kindness, generosity, or paternalism. From women, they want devotion, service, and sex. Heterosexual male culture is homoerotic. It is man-loving. So according to Marilyn Frye, the love of heterosexual men is reserved for other men. And as we know, the attention of homosexual men is focused on other men. And according to the heterosexual script, women should be loyal and devoted to men. Women should focus their sensual and sexual attention on men. So question, what about the women who refuse? What about the women who reject that script? Again, heterosexuality has been imposed on women forcibly and subliminally, yet everywhere women have resisted it, often at the cost of physical torture or imprisonment, psychosurgery, social ostracism, and extreme poverty. Despite all of these forces, women still find ways to say no to men and instead say yes to women. Adrienne Rich says that women have always resisted male tyranny, often despite brutal punishments, and this is a central fact of women's history. She says, because heterosexuality is forced, we should expect women's resistance to it. So let's look more closely at some of the women who have resisted compulsory heterosexuality over time. These women are named in Adrienne Rich's text. First off, the Beguines of Europe. Here is the Beguinenhof in Amsterdam, and on the right is an image of a Beguine woman from the year 1489. And they were popular from the year around 1200 to around 1500. And of course, we are here in the Beguine, named after the Beguines. The 13th century was a so-called golden age for the Beguines in medieval Europe. Today, over 300 Beguinishes have been documented in Belgium alone. Almost all of those have been since destroyed. Only around 30 survive today. But there are records of Beguines all over what is today called Belgium, the Netherlands, France, Germany, Austria, Hungary, Luxembourg, Poland, England. They were everywhere. To be a Beguine, it meant that you lived among only women. You vowed never to marry. Groups of women in the Beguinages, or the Beguinenhof, they would live together. They would share the house or they would rent to each other. These were mostly upper class women and practicing Christians, but they were economically independent from men. They worked as bakers, as nurses, They ran schools for girls. They managed to live independently of both marriage and a formal religious order, like in a monastery or a nunnery. There was something a little bit different. That is until the Christian church started burning them for heresy, but that's another story. If you want to read more about that, check out Silvia Federici's book. She explains about the heretics. Moving on, another example is the comb sisters, or the self-combed women of China in the 19th and 20th centuries. These were women in China who were economically independent from men. They lived only among other women, and they rejected marriage. So we see a pattern here. One of their sayings was, "Earn your own money, cook your own food." They lived together in communal homes in many of the villages of the Canton Delta, what is now called the Pearl River Delta in China. These women played a crucial role in the production of silk before and after the process was industrialized, and they led successful revolts in the silk mills. They are called comb sisters, or self-combed women, because of a marriage tradition. In the 19th century, unmarried women would wear their hair in a long braid. At the wedding ceremony, an older female relative would undo that braid and then comb it into a bun. And the bun signified that the woman was no longer a child. She was now stepping into the role of wife. The comb sisters, however, did their own combing up, or their self-combing. And it was like a rite of initiation into the community. A lot of great research into the comb sisters was done by Yingjia Tan, who found this photo hanging in one of the communal homes in Shaoqing. It's not dated, but you can see perhaps this was kind of the practice for a ceremony. And they look so happy. Here is another example. It's a comic by Caitlin Chan called The Notorious Comb Sisters. And she says, the simplified narrative of Chinese women's history I had internalized, centered on foot binding and arranged marriages. The Comb sisters, with their ritualized spinsterhood, offer a parallel history that paints a more vivid picture of women's interior lives and desires. If we look close enough, we can find many other examples of women resisting the status quo of heterosexuality, rejecting the script, trying to live independently from men with the commitment, the intention, and the focus of their life energies towards other women. So I can think of some other examples. These are not mentioned in Rich's text. She mentioned Sappho. But another example that I thought of is the Boston marriage. In the 19th and 20th centuries, women would live together as life partners. Sometimes these relationships were recognized as being romantic. Other times they were recognized as simply platonic. Who knows? Not a lot of record keeping there. But basically, these women would be economically independent from men. And we see the ladies of Llangollen is a very famous example of a Boston marriage. There's also Sappho and her school for women in the 7th century BC. Now, this is not Sappho herself. Probably not Sappho. This is a fresco found in Pompeii. But since the woman is holding a book and a pen, people just call it Sappho because she's famous for her poetry, or whatever poetry survived, because, as we know, these things are destroyed over time. Sappho herself is regarded as the 10th muse, and her poetry, or what survives of it, expresses a sincere passion admiration and longing toward other women. And another really great example is the recent 4B movement in South Korea. It is now 6T4B, and the 6B4T, thank you. 6B4T, and the B stands for no, the T stands for reject. And it means no dating, no sex, no marriage, no childbirth. It also means to reject, here it says beauty standards, hypersexualization, religion, and also pop culture. And maybe we can talk a little bit more about this in the discussion. Another part of the 6B4T is actually for women to have solidarity with each other. And you see here, solidarity, B helps B. So if we think of heterosexuality as natural for women, then the lives of these woman-identified women are seen as pathological, deviant, deprived of something. Woman identification is dismissed as simply a lifestyle, instead of taken seriously as a woman's conscious decision about how to exist and move through the world. Adrienne Rich says, the fact is that women in every culture and throughout history have undertaken the task of independent, non-heterosexual, woman-connected existence to the extent made possible by their context, often in the belief that they were the only ones to ever have done so. It's important to remember the social context in which women are living, the extent to which women can resist the institution of compulsory heterosexuality depends on the punishments and the forces of any given time and place. The extent to which women can live a woman-centered life depends on her social context. So if we keep that in mind, we can see different forms of resistance throughout women's history. And so Adrienne Rich proposes a new framework called the lesbian continuum, to include a range of women-identified experiences through each woman's life and throughout history. Now, the original essay was published in 1980, and in 2004, Adrienne Rich wrote some reflections about that essay. And in her reflections, she said that calling it the lesbian continuum was a bit clumsy. It could have just been called the woman-identified continuum, and that's why I put this here. Because it is about woman-identified experiences, not just about sexual or genital contact. This continuum includes many forms of primary intensity between women, the sharing of an inner life, giving and receiving support, also bonding against male tyranny. This concept helps us put the context of women's lives, the forces of compulsory heterosexuality, into the equation. And it's also meant to help connect lesbians with women who are in heterosexuality. Basically, it means we have a lot more in common than we think. Rich says, if we look at women's radical rebellions, we can observe behaviors that are deeply connected with the physical passion of woman for woman, which is central to lesbian existence. It's no surprise that women are at the heart of most revolutions, and that lesbians are at the heart of most feminist movements. When women resist the tyranny of men, of the government, of the gods, when women say no to the heterosexual script, that is an act of rebellion. And so in the context of these forces, we can understand that lesbianism is politically significant. Rich says that lesbian existence breaks a taboo. It's also a rejection of a compulsory way of life. It is a direct or indirect attack on the male right of access to women. She says lesbian existence has been lived without access to any knowledge of a tradition, a continuity, or a social underpinning. She says feminism needs to expand in a way that allows us to perceive women's behavior as a form of resistance, as a sign of women seeking liberation. This resistance has reemerged in every culture, in every period of time, even when the women doing the resistance had no idea about other resistance movements, much like how some lesbians reject the script without ever knowing about other lesbians, without ever having someone tell them that lesbianism is an option. But it's unfortunate that the word lesbian has a medical or a pornographic connotation. The words to describe lesbians in many languages are often derogatory, or they have negative connotations. Some lesbians prefer to play it safe, and they call themselves gay, like gay women, but this is not accurate, says Adrienne Rich, and I also agree. Lesbians are often grouped together with homosexual men to form the gay community, because on the outside, it looks like we have a lot in common. But question, is that true? I love this because it's one of the protest signs that some friends of mine used at a demo a few years ago. Gay communities do exist, where lesbians and gay men work together, help each other. Here in Berlin, for example, there are strong gay networks, gay publications, gay events, even financial support from the government for all of this. But most of what is considered gay culture is male-centered. BDSM events, the celebration of drag, or the reclaiming of the slur queer. Using words like gay or queer makes it impossible for anyone to comprehend the lesbian experience, which Adrienne Rich says is a profoundly female experience. Being a lesbian is not just about saying no to men. Again, it's about saying yes to women. And I would like to quote Claire Huchin one more time. She made 2 different posts. So the first quote is from one, and the second quote is from another post. She says, just as patriarchy rewards the cool girl for distancing herself from feminist ideals, queer politics rewards the lesbian for claiming any other label. Queer politics asks that we jettison the word lesbian for something soft and cuddly like woman-loving woman, or vague enough to avoid conveying a strict set of sexual boundaries, like queer. It asks that we abandon the specifics of our sexuality to pacify others. And later she says, devoid of concrete definitions, to be queer is to be sexually fluid, which means the term queer is male inclusive. Using the word queer to refer to lesbians is just another tactic of denying the existence of lesbians, politically and personally. The lesbian experience cannot be understood from a male-identified perspective. Lumping lesbians together with gay men just because homosexuality is stigmatized is actually an act of female erasure. It bears repeating once again that women's sexual and emotional coupling with men is forced, it's imposed, and it's rewarded. If women and if lesbians could just take our eyes off the guys, as Sonia Johnson says, then we could realize a new power. Rich says, woman identification is a source of energy, a potential springhead of female power, curtailed and contained under the institution of heterosexuality. When women become woman-identified, we can connect with each other on new levels and truly begin the work of self-creation. This is also true for lesbians. If lesbians become woman-identified, we can realize a new strength. Rich describes the lesbian existence as a kind of electric powering charge between women. She puts lesbians into the context of liberation and sees lesbian feminism as a feminism of action. Women's passion for women, women's choice of women as allies or companions or as community, women's relationships with women in general must not be made invisible. And the work of such women-identified women, the work of self-creation, must not be undervalued. This work is not the result of penis envy. These women are not simply man-haters, even though I think it's fine to hate men. And so the question will inevitably arise, are we supposed to condemn all heterosexual relationships, even those that are the least oppressive? Rich says, this is the wrong question. We shouldn't allow ourselves to be caught up in false dichotomies of good versus bad, liberated sex versus prostitution, marriage for love versus arranged marriage. She says, within the institution of heterosexuality, there are, of course, differences in the experience. But the real question is really whether or not women have a choice in any of this at all. The absence of choice remains the great unacknowledged reality. And in the absence of choice, women will remain dependent upon the chance or luck of particular relationships and will have no collective power to determine the meaning and the place of sexuality in their lives. So there are so many forces working against women that limit our view, that constrict our autonomy in the world and in our minds. But whenever we resist those forces, we take another step towards creating a new world. Each of us has a finite amount of precious life energy, as my friend Falcon once said. When women make the choice consciously to share that precious energy with one another, to focus their attentions away from men and instead on women, to direct their emotional and erotic loyalties to women, we plant the seeds of liberation in our individual and collective lives. In order for this to happen, I will argue that we need separatism. Not just separatist events like tonight, but separatism in action. Separatism is a legitimate feminist political strategy. However, it is important to notice the difference between separatism and segregation. Susan Hawthorne, who wrote a book called In Defense of Separatism, says that on the one hand, segregation is an instance of coercive power, a manifestation of domination. And on the other hand, separatism is a means of resisting oppression. So the difference is who is making that choice. Remember the male sex right that Sheila Jeffreys, for example, has talked about, where men feel entitled to access women's bodies for sexual purposes. Marilyn Frye, again, she's written many great things. Marilyn Frye talks about separatism in reference to that concept of being accessible. In her essay on separatism and power, she says, quote, "When those who control access have made you totally accessible, your first act of taking control must be denying access. It is not because you are charged up with negativity. It is the logic of the situation. When we start from a position of total accessibility, there must be an aspect of no saying in order to shift power. So separatism is a means of creating collective power. During the second wave of feminism, multitudes of women who previously believed themselves to be heterosexual left their boyfriends and husbands and instead started living with other women. They became separatist. There was a great awakening of feminist consciousness, as well as a change in women's perceptions of women and men. And through this awakening, many of these women became lesbians. Adrienne Rich says that there is a feminist content in the act of choosing a woman lover or life partner in the face of institutionalized heterosexuality. But for lesbian existence to realize this political content in a liberating form, this erotic choice must deepen and expand into conscious woman identification, into lesbian feminism. I have seen firsthand how some lesbians themselves are incredibly male identified. They might sleep with women, but in all other parts of life, they prioritize men, they identify with men, their perspective is informed by male perspectives. So the work and the feminist responsibility of becoming woman identified is really on all of our shoulders, even if some of us are already sexual separatists. There is more to liberation than that. And I would like to end with a quote from a pamphlet from 1970 called "The Woman Identified Woman." It is the primacy of women relating to women, of women creating a new consciousness of and with each other, which is at the heart of women's liberation and the basis for the cultural revolution. So thank you all. That was